The Montana night was relentless, rain hammering down in sheets that turned the soil to mud. Michael Garrett's shoulders ached as he drove the shovel deeper into the earth, his weathered hands gripping the handle with desperate intensity. The beam of his flashlight illuminated an ancient metal chest, its corroded surface promising secrets buried for nearly a century. His breathing came in ragged bursts, fogging in the cold night air. Beside him, Shadow's gray and white coat was slick with rain, the German shepherd's ears suddenly perking up. A low growl rumbled from the dog's chest. A warning. Michael froze, his military instincts kicking in. The distant crunch of tires on gravel cut through the patter of rain. Headlights swept through the trees, piercing the darkness. Michael worked frantically to cover the chest, throwing mud and debris over his discovery. Shadow's growl deepened as the vehicle approached. The headlights caught Michael in their glare, momentarily blinding him. A car door slammed. A silhouette emerged from the darkness, the unmistakable outline of a gun in hand. "I've waited 30 years to reclaim what's mine, Garrett," a cold voice called out. The words hung in the air between them. Michael squinted against the light, confusion washing over his face. "How do you know my name?" The crack of gunfire shattered the night. 6 months earlier, the world looked very different to Michael Garrett. At 42, his body carried the marks of a decade serving as a combat engineer in Afghanistan. The physical scars had healed better than the invisible ones. The nightmares still came 3 or 4 nights a week, vivid replays of the IED explosion that had taken his squad. In the dreams, he was always too late to save them, always watching helplessly as the blast tore through the convoy. The VA apartment in Seattle felt like a prison cell, the city noises triggering his hypervigilance. Every car horn became an alarm, every slamming door a detonation. The medications helped dull the edges, but they also dulled everything else. Michael existed rather than lived, a ghost haunting his own life. The only constant was Shadow, the 5-year-old German shepherd who had become more than a service dog. Shadow was trained to detect the subtle changes in Michael's body chemistry before a panic attack, to provide deep pressure therapy during flashbacks, to wake him from nightmares. But to Michael, Shadow was simply the one living being who didn't look at him with pity or impatience. The dog asked nothing of him except presence. "What do you think, boy?" Michael asked, scrolling through real estate listings on his laptop. Shadow's head rested heavily on his thigh, brown eyes tracking the movement on the screen. "Montana looks quiet, middle of nowhere, just trees and mountains and silence." And the compensation payment from the Army had finally come through after years of bureaucratic battles. Combined with his savings, it wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start over somewhere new. Somewhere without crowds, without noise, without the constant reminders of what he'd lost and who he'd been. A listing caught his eye: 40 acres in Whitefish, Montana, near Glacier National Park. The price was suspiciously low, about a third of market value for that area. The description was sparse: undeveloped land, sold as is, motivated seller, quick close possible. Michael clicked through the few photos: sweeping meadows, dense pine forest, a small creek cutting through the property. Something about it pulled at him, a sense of recognition he couldn't place. He'd never been to Montana, yet the land seemed to call to him specifically. 3 weeks later, Michael signed the final paperwork in the sterile office of JL Real Estate. Jennifer Lane, the agent handling the sale, was polished and efficient, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "This property has been on and off the market for years," she said, sliding the deed across the desk. "The previous owner was a trust that's being dissolved. They're just looking to unload it." "Any particular reason it hasn't sold before now?" Michael asked, pen hovering over the signature line. Jennifer's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's quite remote. Most buyers want amenities, access to town. This is for someone who really wants solitude." She paused. "There's no historical survey of structures or improvements. The sale is explicitly as is." "That works for me," Michael said, signing his name with a deliberate stroke. "I'm not looking for neighbors." Jennifer quickly gathered the papers, her eagerness to conclude the transaction obvious. "Congratulations, Mr. Garrett. You now own a piece of Montana wilderness." 2 days later, Michael and Shadow stood at the edge of their new property, the afternoon sun filtering through towering pines. The drive from Seattle had been long but therapeutic, the landscape gradually transforming from urban sprawl to pristine wilderness. Michael had felt the tension in his shoulders loosening with each passing mile. The narrow dirt road leading to the property was barely maintained, the final half-mile nearly impassable without his four-wheel drive. Perfect, no unexpected visitors. The land spread out before them, gently rolling hills, meadows speckled with wildflowers, dense forest creating natural boundaries. In the distance, the snow-capped peaks of Glacier National Park rose majestically against the blue sky. This is it, Shadow. Home. The word felt strange on his tongue. Michael hadn't had a real home since his parents died in that car crash when he was 11. Foster care had taught him homes were temporary, conditional things that could be taken away. The military had reinforced that lesson. Shadow bounded ahead, investigating the new territory with enthusiasm, nose to the ground. Michael watched him, a rare smile softening his weathered features. He'd start simple, a tent for now, then maybe a small cabin. He had the skills for it. Building had been his life before and during his service. There was something appealing about creating a structure with his own hands, something permanent and solely his. That night, Michael sat outside his tent, a small campfire pushing back the darkness. Above him, the stars were impossibly bright, untainted by city lights. The silence was profound, no traffic, no sirens, no human voices. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of a nightbird. Shadow lay beside him, head on pause, alert but relaxed. For the first time in years, Michael felt something like peace. Here, the memories of Afghanistan seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Here, there were no expectations, no sideways glances from civilians who didn't understand, no forced conversations with well-meaning therapists. Just the land, the sky, and the promise of tomorrow being what he made it. He slept without nightmares that night. The next few days fell into a simple rhythm. Michael hiked the boundaries of his property, mapping it mentally, noting the best location for a permanent structure. The southern slope caught the morning sun, protected from the prevailing winds by a natural ridge. Near the creek would provide easy access to water. He marked potential sites with surveyor's flags. Shadow always a few steps ahead or behind. The dog's happiness at this new life obvious in his prancing gait and alert posture. On the third day, something changed. Michael was measuring distances between marker flags when he realized Shadow was no longer in sight. The absence hit him like a physical blow. Shadow was never far from his side. Shadow! His voice echoed through the trees. Nothing. No familiar bark, no sound of approaching paws. The rational part of Michael's brain knew Shadow was well-trained, unlikely to wander far. The part shaped by loss and trauma immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. Shadow! Panic edged into his voice now. The woods suddenly seemed darker, more threatening. His heart rate accelerated, the first symptoms of a panic attack building. Michael forced himself to breathe deeply, to focus. Think like a tracker. Shadow wouldn't leave without reason. A distant bark pulled him from the spiral. Then another, more urgent. Michael moved toward the sound, pushing through a thicket of overgrown shrubs that scratched at his arms. The barking grew more insistent, a tone he'd never heard from Shadow before. Not fear, but something like discovery mixed with urgency. Michael broke through the undergrowth into a small clearing and stopped short. Shadow stood before what appeared to be a structure, so overgrown with vines and vegetation, it had been completely camouflaged from even 20 feet away. The dog was frantically pawing at a weather-beaten wooden door, looking back at Michael with an intensity that was startling. It was a shed or small outbuilding, constructed of rough-hewn timber that had weathered to a silvery gray. The roof sagged slightly, but the structure looked surprisingly solid despite its apparent age. Vines had completely engulfed one wall, while saplings had grown up around the foundation, nature doing its best to reclaim the man-made intrusion. "What is it, boy?" Michael approached cautiously. This building hadn't been mentioned in any of the property documents, though Jennifer's vague as-is comment made more sense now. Shadow continued pawing at the door, whining with uncharacteristic impatience. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, ancient and rusted but still functional. Michael examined it, noting the craftsmanship. This was no simple master lock, but something custom-made, substantial. The kind of lock used to protect valuables, not garden tools. "Hold on," he told Shadow, returning to his campsite to retrieve tools. The dog refused to leave the shed, standing guard as if afraid it might disappear in his absence. Michael returned with bolt cutters. The lock was stubborn, decades of exposure having fused its components. But Michael's strength eventually prevailed. The mechanism broke with a satisfying snap that echoed in the quiet forest. Shadow's tail wagged once, his eyes fixed on the door. The hinges protested with a haunting creak as Michael pushed the door open. A puff of stale air rushed out, carrying the musty scent of abandonment and time. Michael used his arm to clear cobwebs from the entrance, then pulled a flashlight from his pocket and stepped inside. Shadow immediately at his heels. The beam cut through decades of darkness, revealing a time capsule. Unlike many abandoned structures that suffer from water damage or animal intrusions, this shed had remained remarkably preserved, sealed tight against the elements. A fine layer of dust covered everything, but the contents were intact, frozen in time. Along one wall stood a workbench with antique tools hanging above it. Hand drills, planes, saws, their wooden handles worn smooth from use. In one corner, farming implements leaned against the wall. A scythe, a pitchfork, a hand plow. Shelves held mason jars, oil lamps, and various containers whose purposes were no longer obvious. But it was the center of the room that drew Michael's attention. A large wooden table held what appeared to be architectural drawings, their edges curling with age but the lines still crisp and precise. Michael approached, his engineer's eye immediately recognizing the quality of the draftsmanship. These weren't amateur sketches but professional blueprints, meticulously rendered with attention to detail that spoke of formal training. Shadow, however, wasn't interested in the blueprints. The dog moved methodically around the perimeter of the room, nose to the floor, tracing some scent only he could detect. His behavior was focused, deliberate, as if following specific instructions. Michael carefully examined the blueprints. They depicted a grand house, far more elaborate than the simple cabin he'd been planning. Multiple stories, wraparound porches, detailed millwork. The design was ambitious and elegant, combining practical frontier sensibilities with more refined architectural elements. These were plans for a home meant to last generations, to become a legacy. In the bottom right corner, where an architect would sign their work, was not a name but a symbol, the initials WM enclosed within an inverted triangle. Michael felt a strange chill run through him, a sense of déjà vu so powerful it made him dizzy. He'd seen this symbol before, somewhere, somehow. Shadow's bark startled him from his reverie. The dog had stopped at the far corner of the shed, pawing insistently at the floorboards. Michael joined him, kneeling to examine what had captured the animal's attention. The boards here sounded different when tapped, hollow, suggesting a space beneath. "Good boy," Michael murmured, running his hand through Shadow's thick fur. He pried at the edges of the floorboard with a screwdriver from the workbench. The wood was stubborn but eventually yielded, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside the cavity were several wooden crates, carefully stacked and remarkably well preserved, protected from moisture and pests by the tight seal of the compartment. Michael lifted out the top crate, placing it on the workbench. The wood was solid oak, darkened with age but intact. Inside, carefully packed, were stacks of photographs, their sepia tones speaking of another era. The images showed men and women in early 1900s attire, formal portraits and candid moments captured in the style of the period. One photo in particular caught Michael's attention, a group standing before a grand house that matched the blueprints on the table. On the back, written in faded ink, "Blackwoods Estate, 1918. Shadow continued to whine, clearly unsatisfied with this discovery. He returned to the hidden compartment, nosing at a second crate. Michael obliged, retrieving it. This box contained bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, their paper brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant, flowing script that spoke of an era when penmanship was an art. As fascinating as these discoveries were, they raised more questions than answers. Who had built this shed? Why hide these items so carefully? And why did that symbol feel so hauntingly familiar? The third crate held the most surprising contents, a collection of personal effects. A pocket watch, a silver hairbrush, cufflinks, and at the bottom, a small velvet pouch. Michael opened it carefully, tipping the contents into his palm. It was a ring, not an extravagant diamond engagement ring by modern standards, but a carefully crafted gold band with a modest solitaire stone. Engraved inside the band was that same symbol, WM within an inverted triangle. Michael sat back on his heels, mind racing. The symbol triggered something deep in his memory, a connection he couldn't quite grasp. Then it hit him. His grandfather's ring, a family heirloom Michael had kept after his parents' death. The only possession he'd managed to hold on to through years in the foster system. That ring, currently in his duffel bag back at the campsite, bore the exact same symbol. The coincidence was too specific to be random. Somehow, impossibly, he had purchased land with a direct connection to his own family history, a history he knew almost nothing about. His parents had rarely spoken of their backgrounds, and after their death, there had been no relatives to fill in the blanks. The foster system had been more concerned with processing paperwork than preserving family histories. The next morning found Michael at the Whitefish Public Library, a charming stone building in the heart of the small town. Shadow waited patiently in the truck, the windows cracked to allow the cool mountain air to circulate. Inside, Michael approached the main desk, where an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. "I hope so," Michael replied. "I'm researching local history, specifically a family called Blackwood. I recently purchased land that I think might have belonged to them." The woman's eyes lit up with interest. "The Blackwoods? Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Sarah Miller, the town historian." She extended her hand. "Where exactly is this property?" Michael described the location, watching as recognition dawned on Sarah's face. "That's part of the old Blackwood estate," she confirmed. "One of the most prominent families in the region during the early 1900s. They owned half the valley at one point." She studied him curiously. "That land hasn't changed hands in decades. It's been tied up in some kind of trust arrangement. Do you have records about the family? Photographs, maybe?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Follow me to the archives. The Blackwoods were significant contributors to the development of this area. We have quite a collection." The archives room was a treasure trove of local history, glass display cases, file cabinets, and shelves lined with binders and photo albums. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, pulling materials as she spoke. "The Blackwoods made their fortune in timber and railroads," she explained. "Edward Blackwood was the patriarch, came west in the 1880s, built an empire. His son James expanded into banking and real estate." She placed a large photo album on the table. "They were known for philanthropy too, funded the hospital, the first public school, even this library." The album contained formal portraits of stern-faced men in suits and women in high-necked dresses, standing before imposing houses or seated in ornate parlors. The wealth was evident in every image: the clothes, the settings, the confident postures of people accustomed to privilege. "My grandmother worked for them as a housekeeper," Sarah added, a personal note entering her voice. "She always said they were demanding but fair employers. Better than most in that era." Michael turned pages slowly, scanning for anything that might connect to the blueprints or the mysterious WM symbol. On the third page, he stopped. There was the house from the blueprints, not a photograph but an architectural rendering, presented as if for approval. "That's the Blackwood estate," Sarah confirmed. "Magnificent, wasn't it? Burned down in the 1940s, never rebuilt. Such a tragedy." "Do you know who designed it?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sarah tapped her chin thoughtfully. "The architect? I believe it was someone they brought in from back east. The Blackwoods only worked with the best." She frowned slightly. "Though there was some controversy about the design, if I recall my grandmother's stories correctly." "What kind of controversy?" "Something about disputed credit. The official architect of record was some famous fellow from Chicago, but there were rumors that the actual design work was done by someone local who wasn't given proper recognition." She shrugged. "The politics of the powerful. Some things never change." Michael hesitated, then pulled out his phone, showing Sarah a photo he'd taken of the WM symbol. "Does this mean anything to you?" Sarah studied the image, her brow furrowing. Can't say that it does specifically, but it reminds me of how craftsmen would sign their work back then. Not always with full names, often just initials or a personal mark. She looked up at Michael. Where did you see this? It was on some old blueprints I found on the property, he said, not mentioning the shed or the hidden crates. Something told him to keep those discoveries private for now. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Her historian's curiosity piqued. You know, there's someone you should talk to. Thomas Blackwood. He's the last living person in town with direct connection to the family. He's in his late 70s now, lives at the Whitefish Care Center. If anyone would recognize that symbol, it would be him. Michael thanked Sarah for her help, collecting the information about Thomas Blackwood. As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. One more thing you should know, she said, her voice lower now. If you're planning to do anything with that land, you might run into some resistance. Harold Montgomery has been buying up all the old Blackwood properties for years. He's got plans for a massive resort development in that area. Montgomery? Any relation to the Blackwoods? He claims to be a distant relative, great-grandson of James Blackwood through marriage, I believe. He's got money and influence, sits on half the town boards. Sarah's expression suggested she wasn't a fan. Just a friendly warning. People have a way of running into problems when they stand in Harold's way. Michael left the library with more questions than answers, but at least now he had a direction. The connection between his family ring and the symbol on the blueprints couldn't be coincidence. Somehow his grandfather's ring and this land shared a history someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. The Whitefish Care Center was a modern facility set against the backdrop of mountains, its architecture designed to maximize natural light and views. Michael found Thomas Blackwood in the common room, a thin man with a shock of white hair and remarkably alert blue eyes. Despite his age, Thomas sat straight-backed in his chair, dignity evident in his posture. Mr. Blackwood, I'm Michael Garrett. The librarian Sarah Miller suggested I speak with you. Thomas regarded Michael with cautious curiosity. Sarah's a good woman, knows more about this town's history than anyone. His voice was stronger than his frame suggested. What can I do for you, Mr. Garrett? Michael explained about purchasing the land, finding the blueprints, and his interest in the history behind them. He was careful, revealing only what was necessary, guided by an instinct to hold back the full extent of his discoveries. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When Michael finished, the older man was silent for a long moment, studying him with unexpected intensity. Why this sudden interest in old Blackwood history? Thomas finally asked. Michael hesitated, then decided on honesty. He pulled out his phone, showing Thomas the photo of the WM symbol. I found this on the blueprints. It resonated with me. I'm trying to understand why. Thomas's reaction was immediate and startling. His face paled and his hand trembled as he reached for the phone, bringing it closer to his eyes. Where did you see this? His voice had lost its strength, becoming almost a whisper. On architectural drawings in an old shed on the property, Michael answered, watching the older man carefully. Do you recognize it? Thomas handed the phone back, his eyes now wary. You should sell that land, Mr. Garrett. Take whatever profit you can and move on. Some histories are better left buried. I need to know what this symbol means, Michael pressed, leaning forward. Please. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Finally, Thomas sighed, the sound of a man surrendering to inevitability. WM. Those were the initials of William Morrison, he said, his voice low. He wasn't a Blackwood. He worked in for them as an architect and engineer, designing buildings throughout the region in the early 1900s. So he designed the Blackwood estate. Thomas nodded slowly. William was brilliant, self-taught mostly. Edward Blackwood recognized his talent, hired him to work directly for the family, rather than through an architectural firm. William designed many of their most significant buildings, including the main estate. His gaze drifted to the window, to the mountains beyond. But he was never given public credit. The Blackwoods brought in established architects from the East to put their names on the official documents. It was how things were done then. Michael sensed there was more to the story. What happened to him? To Morrison? Thomas's expression darkened. He disappeared in 1923. There was a fire at his workshop, suspected arson, though it was never proven. Everyone assumed he died in the blaze, but no body was ever found. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. The timing was significant. How so? William had formed an attachment to Catherine Blackwood, Edward's granddaughter and James's only child. They kept it secret, of course. He was an employee. She was practically royalty in these parts. But somehow James found out. Thomas's voice had taken on the cadence of a man recounting a familiar tragedy. The fire happened the very night they had planned to leave together. The pieces began to fall into place in Michael's mind. They were in love. Desperately so, according to family legend, Thomas confirmed. Catherine was devastated by William's disappearance. A month later, she was married off to Richard Montgomery, son of her father's business partner. A suitable match by the standards of the time. The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. And she never knew what really happened to William? Thomas's gaze returned to Michael, sharp and assessing. Why are you so interested in this old story, Mr. Garrett? What does it matter to you? Michael removed his grandfather's ring from his pocket, holding it up so Thomas could see the identical WM symbol engraved inside the band. Because I think William Morrison might be my great-grandfather. Thomas stared at the ring, his composure cracking. For a moment, he looked every one of his 78 years, the weight of secrets visibly pressing down on him. You need to be careful, he finally said. Harold Montgomery has spent decades burying this history. He won't take kindly to someone digging it up now. Montgomery? The developer Sarah mentioned? Catherine's grandson, or so he claims. Thomas's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. He's been systematically acquiring all the old Blackwood properties, erasing any trace of William Morrison from the historical record. If he finds out you're asking questions. He didn't finish the thought. Michael left the care center with his mind reeling. The connection to his own family history was becoming clearer, yet the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. If William Morrison had truly disappeared in 1923, how did his ring end up with Michael's grandfather? And why would Harold Montgomery, nearly a century later, care so much about erasing William's contributions? Back at his campsite, Michael spread out his discoveries on a folding table. The photographs, selected letters he'd brought from the shed, and the blueprints. Shadow lay nearby, watching with that uncanny intelligence that sometimes made Michael wonder how much the dog actually understood. The blueprints were remarkable in their detail, showing not just the structure, but intricate specifications for woodwork, stonework, and decorative elements. Michael's trained eye recognized the work of a master craftsman, someone who understood both aesthetics and engineering principles. But there was something else, subtle irregularities in some of the measurements. Notations that didn't quite align with standard architectural practice. These aren't mistakes, Michael murmured to Shadow. They're deliberate, like a code. On impulse, Michael pulled out his own ring, comparing it directly to the symbol on the blueprints. The match was exact. Not just the initials, but the specific calligraphy and the unusual inverted triangle surrounding them. This wasn't just a generic maker's mark, it was a highly personalized signature. That night, Michael dreamed of Afghanistan again, but this time the dream twisted in new directions. The familiar scene of the convoy explosion blended with images of fire consuming a wooden workshop. The screams of his dying comrades merging with a woman's desperate calls for William. He awoke gasping, sweat-soaked despite the cool mountain air. Shadow was already alert, paws on Michael's chest, licking his face. The dog's trained response to nightmares. I'm okay, boy, I'm okay. Michael sat up, running shaking hands through his hair. The dream, it felt different. Not just the usual traumatic replay, but something deeper. As if memories not his own had somehow infiltrated his subconscious. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to find this land, that Shadow's discovery of the shed was more than chance. The rational part of his mind rejected such mystical thinking, but his experiences in combat had taught him that sometimes intuition operated on levels beyond conscious understanding. At first light, Michael returned to the shed, determined to examine every inch more carefully. The morning sun streamed through small gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny constellations. Without the shock of initial discovery, Michael could now appreciate the craftsmanship of the structure itself. The joinery was expert, the proportions harmonious despite its utilitarian purpose. This wasn't just a storage building thrown together with whatever materials were at hand. It had been designed and built with care. Shadow moved directly to the hidden compartment in the floor, clearly expecting Michael to retrieve the remaining crates. The fourth and final crate was smaller than the others, but significantly heavier. Unlike the others, this one was secured with a small brass lock. More secrets, Michael muttered, examining the lock. It was ornate, decorative, the kind used for jewelry boxes or valuable documents, not utilitarian storage. He couldn't bring himself to break it, respecting the clear intention to protect whatever lay inside. A more thorough examination of the shed revealed something Michael had missed in his initial exploration: the building's dimensions. Using his military-grade tape measure, he confirmed his suspicion. The interior measurements didn't match the exterior. There was a discrepancy of about 3 feet along the back wall. Shadow had been watching Michael work, but now the dog moved to the wall in question, sniffing intently along the base. Michael joined him, running his hands over the rough wooden planks. Nothing seemed unusual to the touch. No hidden latches or obvious seams. He stepped back, considering. If he had designed a hidden space, how would he access it? His eyes traveled upward, noting how the roof beams met the walls. One beam in particular caught his attention. It didn't quite align with the others, sitting perhaps an inch lower. On impulse, Michael pressed upward against this beam. With a soft click, a section of the wall shifted slightly. Michael pushed, and a concealed door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow space behind the false wall. Shadow immediately stuck his head into the opening, tail wagging with excitement. "Easy, boy," Michael cautioned, shining his flashlight into the space. It was small, perhaps 3 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but immaculately preserved. A single shelf ran along the back wall, holding what appeared to be a leather-bound book in an ornate metal box. Michael carefully removed both items, bringing them to the workbench. The book was a diary, its cover worn but the pages inside remarkably preserved. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine. Each entry dated and signed simply C. The first entry was dated April 12, 1920. "Father has engaged Mr. Morrison to design the new East Wing. I find myself looking forward to our consultations with an eagerness that would surely raise eyebrows were it noticed. There is something in his eyes, a quiet intelligence, an integrity that seems rare in Father's circle. He speaks to me as an equal, not as a decorative accessory to be humored and dismissed. I must be careful not to reveal how much I value these conversations." Michael read entry after entry, watching as Catherine Blackwood's initial professional respect for William Morrison blossomed into friendship, then into a love that both thrilled and terrified her. The diary chronicled their secret meetings, their dreams of a life together far from the constraints of whitefish society, and ultimately, their plan to elope on the night of May 17, 1923. The final entry, dated May 16, 1923, was heartbreaking in its hope and anticipation. "Tomorrow night, we leave this gilded cage forever. William has secured positions for us both in Seattle, he as an architect with a progressive firm that values talent over pedigree, I as a teacher at a women's college. We will be poor by Blackwoods standards, rich in ways my family cannot comprehend. William fears father has grown suspicious. There have been men watching the workshop. But by this time tomorrow, we will be on the train west, beginning our true lives at last. I have packed only what matters, mother's locket, my books, and my heart full of impossible joy." The diary ended there, the remaining pages blank, a narrative cut short at its moment of highest hope. Michael sat back, feeling the weight of a tragedy nearly a century old. Catherine had written those words the night before William supposedly died in the fire. Had she learned of his fate before being forced to marry Richard Montgomery? Or had she gone to their meeting place, waiting for a man who never came? The metal box provided some answers. It was locked, but the key hung on a thin chain wrapped around the box itself. Inside, Michael found a collection of newspaper clippings, official documents, and personal letters, a carefully preserved archive that told the rest of the story. The first item was a newspaper article about the workshop fire dated May 18, 1923. It reported the destruction of William Morrison's architectural studio, with Morrison himself presumed dead, though no remains had been found. The article quoted James Blackwood, expressing shock and sadness at the loss of a talented employee, his concern ringing false even through the yellowed newsprint. But it was a letter dated December 7th, 1923, that revealed the truth. It was written in a different hand than Catherine's diary, stronger, more angular, but with the same underlying emotion. My dearest Catherine, if this reaches you, know that I live. The fire was no accident. Your father's men made that clear when they pulled me from the workshop minutes before the blaze. I was given a choice: disappear forever or be charged with theft of Blackwood property. My own designs, ironically. They put me on a train east with nothing but the clothes on my back and the warning that any attempt to contact you would result in consequences I cannot bear to imagine. I have taken a new name, Walter Garrett, and found work in Chicago. I think of you every moment. I pray you receive this letter, sent through the only friend I trust. If there is any way for you to safely reply, the bearer knows how to reach me. With eternal love, W. Michael's hands trembled as he read the signature. Walter Garrett, his grandfather's name had been Walter Garrett Jr., which would make William Morrison, who became Walter Garrett, his great-grandfather. The remaining documents in the box traced a heartbreaking correspondence. Catherine had indeed received William's letter and responded. For years, they exchanged letters through trusted intermediaries, their love enduring despite the separation. Catherine, trapped in a loveless marriage to Richard Montgomery, confided her misery and her determination to preserve what mattered. The most shocking revelation came in a letter dated March 3rd, 1924. My dearest William, I must tell you something that brings both joy and sorrow. Before our separation, our love created a miracle. I am with child. James suspects the truth but cannot prove it without scandal. He has arranged for Richard to claim the child as his own, to save the family reputation. I cannot bear the thought of our child being raised solely under the Montgomery influence, taught to value wealth and position above all else. I have made arrangements with Margaret, my most trusted lady's maid. When the time comes, she will help me conceal the truth, that I carry twins. One child will remain here, acknowledged as a Montgomery heir. The other will be secretly sent to you in Chicago to be raised with the values we share. It is a desperate plan fraught with risk, but I cannot see another way. Our love deserves to live on, even if we cannot be together. Forever yours, Catherine. The final items in the box were a birth certificate for twins, a boy and a girl, and a faded photograph of a small boy standing beside a tall man whose face was half turned from the camera, but whose stance was unmistakably proud. On the back was written, Walter Jr., age 5, with his father, Chicago, 1929. Michael sat motionless, the weight of this revelation settling over him. He was not just connected to this land by random chance or mysterious coincidence. He was the direct descendant of William Morrison and Catherine Blackwood, their forbidden love carried forward through generations. His great-grandfather had been forced to flee, to change his name, to abandon his work and reputation, but had raised his son, who would become Michael's grandfather. The story explains so much: why Michael had grown up knowing almost nothing about his family history, why his parents had been vague about their backgrounds. The secret had been buried so deeply that even they might not have known the full truth. And now, by some twist of fate or destiny, Michael had found his way back to the very land where it all began, to the evidence his great-grandparents had carefully preserved for future generations. Shadow nudged his hand, bringing Michael back to the present moment. The dog's intelligent eyes seemed to understand the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Michael scratched behind Shadow's ears, grateful for the loyal presence that had led him to these revelations. Good boy, he murmured. You knew, didn't you? Somehow you knew this was waiting for us. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. If Thomas Blackwood was right, Harold Montgomery had spent decades systematically erasing William Morrison from history. Would he view Michael's discoveries, and Michael himself, as a threat? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence. Shadow's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Michael quickly gathered the most important documents, securing them in his backpack, then stepped outside the shed. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up at the edge of the clearing. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, tall, impeccably dressed in casual clothes that nonetheless radiated expense and privilege. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his tan suggesting winters spent far from Montana's snow. Two younger men emerged from the passenger sides, their stances and watchful eyes marking them as security rather than colleagues. Shadow positioned himself between Michael and the newcomers, his posture alert but not yet aggressive. Michael rested a reassuring hand on the dog's head, facing the approaching man with deliberate calm. "You must be Michael Garrett," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm Harold Montgomery. I believe we need to talk about this property." Harold Montgomery's smile was practiced perfection, the kind that appeared in corporate magazines and political campaigns. Everything about him exuded wealth and influence, from his Italian leather boots to the cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Michael's entire wardrobe. "I've been watching this property for some time," Harold said, his voice carrying the polished cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "When it suddenly sold, I was intrigued, especially when I learned the buyer was a Garrett." The way he emphasized the name sent a chill down Michael's spine. Shadow remained alert, his body tense against Michael's leg. "I'm not sure what you mean," Michael replied carefully, mentally cataloging the positions of Harold's security men. They were professionals, military backgrounds most likely, given their stances and watchful eyes. Harold gestured toward the shed. "I see you've discovered William's little time capsule. My grandfather, Richard Montgomery, always suspected he'd left something behind." "You know about William Morrison?" "Of course." Harold's smile tightened. "Family history is a passion of mine. The Blackwoods and Montgomerys built this town. We're its legacy." He paused, studying Michael. "Which makes me curious about your sudden interest in land that's been dormant for decades." "I was looking for somewhere quiet. The price was right." Harold laughed, the sound lacking any real humor. "A decorated combat engineer just happens to buy the exact plot of land connected to his great-grandfather? Come now, Mr. Garrett. We're both intelligent men." The revelation that Harold knew his military background sent another warning signal through Michael's mind. This wasn't a casual visit from a curious neighbor. "I'm developing a resort in this valley," Harold continued, gesturing toward the mountains. "A 5-star destination that will finally put Whitefish on the map properly. Your property is the missing piece, the original heart of the Blackwood estate. It's not for sale." Harold's expression hardened momentarily before his smile returned. "I'm prepared to offer 3 times what you paid, a substantial profit for a few weeks' ownership." "Still not for sale." The security men shifted slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable to Michael's trained eye. A repositioning, closing off escape routes. "5 times then," Harold said, his tone still conversational, but with an edge creeping in. "That's my final offer. You'd be wise to take it." "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested." Michael kept his voice level, his stance relaxed despite the tension building in his shoulders. Shadow pressed closer against his leg, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Harold studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. "I understand. New beginnings can be alluring." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, holding it out. "When you change your mind, call me directly." Michael accepted the card, noting the embossed gold lettering, Montgomery Developments, with Harold's name and a direct number. "One more thing," Harold added, his voice dropping slightly. "The Blackwood Montgomery archives are extensive. William Morrison was creative with the truth. Don't believe everything you read in old letters." The implied threat wasn't subtle. Harold knew exactly what Michael had discovered. "I'll keep that in mind," Michael replied evenly. Harold turned to leave, then paused. "You know, it's interesting. After all these years, a Morrison descendant returns to claim the land. Almost poetic." His smile was cold. "But poetry doesn't hold up well in court, Mr. Garrett. I suggest you research Montana property law before you become too attached to this place." With that, Harold and his men returned to the SUV, the expensive vehicle navigating the rough track with surprising ease. Michael watched until they disappeared from view, the encounter replaying in his mind. The veiled threats, the knowledge of his background, the emphasis on legal battles. Harold Montgomery was not a man who accepted rejection lightly. Shadow whined softly, nudging Michael's hand. The dog's intuition, as always, was spot on. They had just made a powerful enemy. Back at his campsite, Michael spread out the newspaper clipping he'd taken from the Whitefish Library earlier that day. The front page of the town's weekly gazette featured Harold Montgomery at a groundbreaking ceremony for Montgomery Alpine Estates, described as the most exclusive resort development in the Northwest. The article painted Harold as a visionary businessman, fourth-generation resident committed to honoring the Montgomery Blackwood legacy while bringing prosperity to Whitefish. There was no mention of William Morrison. Michael studied Harold's face in the photograph, the confident stance, the proprietary smile as he stood with a golden shovel. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, to rewriting narratives that didn't suit him. The question was how far he would go to secure Michael's land. Sleep came fitfully that night. Michael's dreams were a chaotic blend of Afghanistan and Whitefish, explosions that transformed into burning workshops, the faces of his fallen squad members merging with William Morrison's profile from the old photographs. He woke repeatedly, disoriented and sweating despite the cool mountain air. Each time, Shadow was there, a steady presence grounding him in reality. By dawn, Michael had made his decision. He wouldn't be intimidated into selling, but he needed to understand exactly what he was up against. Harold Montgomery clearly knew more about the Morrison Blackwood history than he was letting on, and Michael needed to level the playing field. His first stop was the Whitefish Public Records Office, a small annex to the county courthouse. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with efficiently short hair and reading glasses on a chain, looked up as he approached. "I'd like to research property records for a parcel just outside town," Michael explained, providing the details of his land. "Historical search?" she asked, fingers already tapping at her keyboard. "As far back as possible." She nodded, unsurprised. "Lot of interest in old properties lately, ever since Montgomery Development started buying up land." She gave him a measuring look. "You working for Harold?" "No, I'm the new owner." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, that's interesting. Follow me." She led him to a small research room with a computer terminal and several large bound volumes on shelves. "Digital records only go back to the 1970s. For anything earlier, you'll need these." She gestured to the leather-bound books. "They're organized by township and range. Your property would be in volumes 17 through 20 for the period between 1900 and 1950. Michael thanked her and settled in for what promised to be hours of painstaking research. The property records were a complex web of transactions, filled with legal jargon and references to landmarks that no longer existed. But his military training had taught him patience and attention to detail. Slowly, the history of his land began to emerge. The earliest records showed the property as part of a much larger parcel owned by Blackwood Timber and Rail, circa 1890. In 1915, a section was partitioned off and gifted to William Morrison, architect, as payment for services rendered. This aligned with what Thomas had told him about William working for the Blackwood family. The most interesting entry came in 1923, just days after the workshop fire. The Morrison property was transferred to James Blackwood for a nominal sum, the transaction witnessed by Richard Montgomery. The timing couldn't be coincidental. This was the legal mechanism used to steal William's land after forcing him to flee. But there was another transaction that caught Michael's attention. In 1942, a small corner of the original Morrison property, the section where the shed now stood, was sold by James Blackwood to a Walter G. Smith for cash. The description matched precisely the location of the shed Michael had discovered. Walter G. Smith, Walter Garrett. The initials were unlikely to be coincidental. William had returned to Whitefish under an assumed name and purchased just enough land to build his hidden archive. The realization sent a wave of admiration through Michael. His great-grandfather had been forced to abandon his life's work and the woman he loved, but he hadn't given up. He created a time capsule of truth, waiting for someone to discover it. The next record showed the entire property, including the shed parcel, being consolidated under Blackwood Montgomery Holdings in 1965, shortly after Catherine's death. It remained under that ownership until being transferred to the Blackwood Trust in '7, which had sold it to Michael just weeks ago. What the records didn't explain was why the trust had suddenly decided to sell after holding the land for decades. Something had changed, some catalyst that had put the property on the market precisely when Michael was searching for a place in Montana. His research was interrupted by the clerk returning with a concerned expression. "You might want to wrap up soon," she said quietly. Just got a call that Harold Montgomery is on his way over. Something about reviewing the same records. Michael thanked her for the warning, quickly photographing the most relevant pages with his phone before gathering his notes. He had no desire to confront Harold again so soon, especially not in a government building where Harold likely had considerable influence. As he left through a side entrance, Michael spotted Harold's black SUV pulling up to the main doors. The encounter at the shed had clearly rattled the developer enough to prompt immediate action. Michael slipped away unseen, shadow trotting faithfully at his side. His next destination was clear. He needed to visit Thomas Blackwood again, this time with specific questions about Walter G. Smith and the 1940s. The Whitefish Care Center was quiet when Michael arrived, the afternoon lull following lunch. He found Thomas in the garden, seated in a wheelchair beneath a maple tree whose leaves had turned brilliant red with the season. The older man looked frailer than during their first meeting, his shoulders hunched against the autumn chill despite the sunshine. "I wondered if you'd come back," Thomas said as Michael approached. His voice was weaker, but his eyes remained sharp. "You found something else." Michael sat on a nearby bench, shadow settling at his feet. "Walter G. Smith," he said without preamble. 1942. He bought the land where the shed stands. Thomas's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a glance around to ensure they weren't overheard. "You've been busy," he murmured. "Was it him? Did William come back?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Yes," he finally said. "He came back several times over the years. Always under different names, always careful. The shed was his memorial, I suppose. A place to preserve what had been stolen from him." "You knew him," Michael realized. "Personally." A sad smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. "Catherine was my aunt. I was just a boy when William built that shed, but I remember him. He would visit Catherine when Richard was away on business. They were still in love, even after all those years apart." The revelation stunned Michael. Thomas wasn't just a Blackwood descendant with historical knowledge. He was directly connected to the people involved, a living link to William and Catherine. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because knowledge is dangerous, Mr. Garrett, especially when it contradicts the official family narrative." Thomas's voice dropped further. "Harold has spent his life building an empire on the Montgomery Blackwood name. The truth about William Morrison threatens that foundation." "What truth?" Thomas studied Michael intently. "How much have you discovered in that shed?" "Letters, photographs, blueprints. I know about the fire, about William fleeing to Chicago and changing his name to Walter Garrett. I know Catherine was pregnant when they were separated." Thomas nodded slowly. "But not the whole truth about the child." "What do you mean?" "Catherine gave birth to twins," Thomas said, the words coming as if each cost him physical effort. "A boy and a girl. The boy was secretly sent to William in Chicago, your grandfather. The girl remained here, raised as Richard Montgomery's daughter. She was my cousin Elizabeth." Michael's mind raced to process this information. "So Harold is your distant cousin, yes, though he doesn't know the full story. He believes Elizabeth was Catherine and Richard's biological child." Thomas's hands trembled slightly. "The Montgomery line has no biological connection to the Blackwoods. The true Blackwood bloodline continued through William and Catherine's children, through you and unknowingly through Harold." The irony was staggering. Harold Montgomery, who prided himself on his Blackwood heritage, was indeed connected to that family, but through the very man whose existence he seemed determined to erase. "Does Harold know about the twins?" "No, that secret died with Catherine and Richard. Even Elizabeth never knew." Thomas paused. "But Harold suspects something isn't right. He's been obsessed with the family history for decades, collecting documents, tracing genealogies. He knows there are gaps, inconsistencies. That's why he wants my land so badly," Michael realized. "He's afraid of what else might be hidden there." "It's more than that," Thomas said, his voice urgent now. "The Blackwood fortune wasn't just in timber and railroads. There were rumors of gold, investments, art collections, significant wealth that disappeared after Edward Blackwood died. Catherine was the last person who knew where it all went." He leaned forward. "Harold believes William stole it somehow, that the real reason James forced him out was theft, not the relationship with Catherine." "And did he take the fortune?" Thomas's expression was unreadable. Catherine always said her father's true legacy wasn't meant for those who valued money above love. He straightened in his wheelchair. You should go now. The staff will be coming to take me inside soon, and I don't want them seeing us together. Why? Because Harold owns this facility, Thomas said simply, and I've already said more than is safe. As if on cue, a nurse appeared at the garden door calling Thomas's name. The older man gripped Michael's arm with surprising strength. Be careful. Check the ring, yours and the one you found. They're not just jewelry. Before Michael could ask what he meant, the nurse was approaching, her smile professional, but her eyes curious about Thomas's visitor. Michael thanked Thomas and left quickly, the new information swirling in his mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. The encounter with Thomas had yielded crucial information, but also raised the stakes dramatically. If Harold suspected Michael knew about the missing Blackwood fortune, a simple land dispute could escalate into something far more dangerous. Back at his campsite, Michael examined both rings carefully. His grandfather's ring that he'd kept all these years, and the one he'd found in the shed. They were nearly identical, gold bands with the WM symbol inside an inverted triangle, but Thomas had hinted they were more than mere symbols. Michael studied them under his flashlight, turning them slowly, looking for any hidden mechanism or inscription. Nothing was immediately apparent. Then on a hunch, he held them side by side, aligning the triangles. They matched perfectly, as if designed as a pair. When he pressed them together, he felt a slight click. The bands had locked together, forming a single ring with a more complex pattern. The joined triangles now created a shape like an hourglass or a simplified butterfly. But more importantly, the connection revealed tiny markings along the inner band that hadn't been visible before. Not words, but a series of dots and lines that looked like coordinates, Michael murmured. Recognizing the pattern from his military training, longitude and latitude, precisely marked in a simple cipher. The rings weren't just symbols of William and Catherine's love. They were a key to finding something they had hidden. Shadow's ears suddenly perked up, his body tensing. A moment later, Michael heard it too, the distant sound of vehicles approaching. He quickly pocketed the rings and moved to the edge of his campsite, staying within the tree line. 2 pickup trucks were making their way up the rough access road, their headlights cutting through the early evening gloom. They weren't Harold's sleek SUV, but the deliberate way they approached, slow, lights dimmed, suggested this wasn't a friendly visit. Michael whistled softly to Shadow, signaling him to stay close and quiet. They retreated further into the trees, finding a position that offered both concealment and a clear view of the campsite. The truck stopped about 50 yards from Michael's tent. 4 men emerged, their movements suggesting purpose rather than casual curiosity. They wore work clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, boots, but their coordinated approach to the campsite revealed training. Not military precision, but people accustomed to working as a team. "Garrett," one of them called out, "just want to talk." Michael remained silent, watching as they spread out around his camp. 2 carried flashlights, sweeping the beams across his tent and gear. Another held what looked like a baseball bat, tapping it against his palm in a casual but unmistakable threat. "We know you're here," the first man called again. "Mr. Montgomery sent us to deliver a message." So they were Harold's men, though not his professional security detail. Local muscle, probably. Men who owed Harold favors or money, sent to intimidate rather than negotiate. When no response came, the man with the bat approached Michael's tent. With a sudden swing, he smashed the support pole, collapsing the structure. The others laughed, emboldened by the destruction. "Property's got hazards," one shouted. "Not safe for camping. Bears, falling trees, all kinds of accidents happen out here." They began systematically trashing the campsite, upending Michael's portable table, kicking over his cooler, smashing his lantern. Shadow trembled against Michael's leg, a low growl building in his chest. Michael placed a calming hand on the dog's head. They were outnumbered, and these men were clearly looking for an excuse to escalate the violence. The smart play was to let them finish their vandalism and leave. After a few minutes of destruction, the men gathered back at their trucks. "Message delivered," the leader called out into the darkness. "Next time, it won't be your gear that gets damaged." They drove off, headlights blazing now, confident in their impunity. Michael waited until the sound of their engines faded completely before returning to the ruined campsite. The damage was comprehensive, his tent destroyed, food supplies scattered, equipment broken. They'd even slashed his sleeping bag and portable chair. The message was clear. Harold Montgomery could make Michael's life impossible. Shadow moved through the wreckage, nose to the ground, tracking the men's scents. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, growling at something in the underbrush. Michael approached cautiously, finding a small black object partially hidden in the leaves. A wireless camera, the kind used for remote surveillance. Its lens pointed directly at what had been his tent. The discovery sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the autumn night. The camera meant this wasn't just intimidation, it was intelligence gathering. Harold wanted to watch Michael's reaction, to assess his resolve, perhaps even to monitor his activities on the property. Michael left the camera where it was. Let Harold think his tactics were working undetected. Information was power in any conflict. And right now, Michael needed every advantage he could get. With his camping gear destroyed, Michael had limited options. He could find a motel in town, but that would mean leaving the property unattended, something he was increasingly reluctant to do. The shed, while dusty and ancient, offered a more secure alternative. At least there, he'd be protected from the elements and could continue his investigation of William's legacy. As he and Shadow made their way through the darkened forest toward the shed, Michael's mind worked through the implications of everything he'd learned. The coordinates hidden in the rings, the missing Blackwood fortune, Harold's escalating intimidation tactics, all pointed to something far more valuable than just the land itself. Something that had been hidden for nearly a century, waiting for the right person to uncover it. The shed looked different in the moonlight, its weathered timbers silvery and ethereal. Michael unlocked the door, Shadow slipping in ahead of him, alert for any sign of intrusion. But the interior was exactly as they had left it, undisturbed by time or trespassers. Michael set up his remaining gear, a backup flashlight, his water canteen, and the emergency blanket from his truck. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in far worse conditions during his deployments. Shadow settled beside him, the dog's warm body a reassuring presence in the chilly building. Before attempting to sleep, Michael returned to the blueprints he'd found earlier. With his new knowledge about hidden messages and coordinates, he examined them with fresh eyes. The architectural drawings were masterfully detailed, but certain measurements seemed off by small, consistent amounts. Lines that should have been perfectly parallel were skewed by fractions of a degree. Not mistakes, Michael murmured to Shadow. Deliberate alterations. He remembered his training in encoding messages within seemingly innocent documents. During his time in Afghanistan, they'd used similar techniques to hide coordinates and meeting locations within routine reports. William had employed the same concept, embedding information within the technical specifications of his designs. Michael worked late into the night, systematically analyzing the deviations, converting them into a coherent pattern. By the time exhaustion finally overcame him, he had identified what appeared to be a sequence of numbers, possibly dates or additional coordinates, hidden within the blueprint's measurements. Morning brought a new challenge. Michael awoke to the sound of vehicles on the property again, but these weren't the pickup trucks from the previous night. Through a crack in the shed's wall, he spotted Harold's black SUV accompanied by a white van marked with the logo of the county assessor's office. Harold stood beside a middle-aged man in a county uniform, gesturing toward the general area of the shed while consulting a tablet. They were conducting an official inspection, likely looking for code violations or any pretext to legally challenge Michael's ownership or use of the property. Shadow watched silently beside Michael, the dog's body tense but disciplined. They needed to remain hidden. Being discovered in the shed would only give Harold more ammunition. Through the crack, Michael could hear fragments of conversation. Unpermitted structure, clearly abandoned for decades. Environmental assessment required for any renovation. Historical preservation restrictions may apply. Harold was laying groundwork for legal obstacles, using his influence with local officials to create bureaucratic hurdles. It was a sophisticated approach, less crude than the previous night's vandalism, but potentially more effective. The inspection lasted nearly an hour, with the county official taking photographs and making notes while Harold pointed out various features of the property. They never approached the shed directly, staying mostly near the access road in the clearing where Michael's campsite had been. Eventually they departed, leaving Michael to consider his next move. He couldn't stay hidden in the shed indefinitely. Harold's tactics would only escalate, and Michael needed allies if he was going to stand his ground. More importantly, he needed to solve the puzzle William had left behind before Harold found a way to seize the property or destroy the evidence. Michael waited until mid-morning before leaving the shed, locking it securely behind him. He and Shadow hiked through the forest, avoiding the main access road, eventually reaching a point where he could safely return to his truck without being observed. His first stop was a hardware store on the outskirts of Whitefish, where he purchased basic camping supplies to replace what had been destroyed. The clerk, a burly man with a gray beard and weathered hands, gave him a curious look as he rang up the items. "Camping gear get damaged?" the man asked conversationally. "Something like that," Michael replied, not wanting to elaborate. The clerk nodded thoughtfully. "You're the fella who bought the old Blackwood parcel, aren't you? Word travels fast in small towns." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "Thought so." The clerk leaned forward slightly. "You should know Montgomery's boys were in here last night, bragging about sending a message to some outsider. Didn't take much to connect the dots when you walked in needing all new gear." "I appreciate the information," Michael said carefully. "Name's Frank," the clerk said, extending a calloused hand. "My family's been here since before the Blackwoods got rich. Never much cared for how the Montgomerys throw their weight around." He paused. "If you're planning to hold your ground out there, you might want to talk to Rachel Hamilton. She's the only lawyer in town who isn't in Harold's pocket." Michael shook the offered hand. "Thanks for the tip." "One more thing," Frank added, lowering his voice. "Whatever you found out there that's got Montgomery's shorts in a twist, a lot of folks around here would be interested to know about it. The Blackwood Montgomery legacy he's always talking about has a lot of chapters he doesn't mention in his press releases." The interaction left Michael thoughtful. Harold might have influence with officials and resources to hire muscle, but he clearly didn't command universal respect or loyalty in Whitefish. There were people who resented his power, people who might become allies. His next stop was the law office of Rachel Hamilton, located in a converted Victorian house a few blocks from the main street. A brass plaque beside the door identified it as Hamilton Legal Services, Civil Rights, Property Law, Environmental Protection. The interior was surprisingly modern given the historic exterior. Clean lines, minimalist furniture, large windows allowing natural light to fill the space. A receptionist looked up as Michael entered, Shadow at his heel. "I don't have an appointment," Michael explained, "but I was hoping to speak with Ms. Hamilton about a property dispute." "May I ask what property?" the receptionist inquired, her tone professional but warm. "The old Blackwood parcel, just outside town." Something flickered in her eyes, recognition, perhaps even interest. "One moment." She pressed a button on her phone. "Rachel, there's a gentleman here about the Blackwood property." She listened briefly, then nodded to Michael. "She'll see you now. Down the hall, last door on the right." Rachel Hamilton was not what Michael had expected. Based on Frank's recommendation, he had imagined someone older, battle-hardened by years of standing against Harold's influence. Instead, he found a woman perhaps in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. She wore not a conventional suit, but dark jeans and a tailored blazer over a simple blouse. Professional, but distinctly her own style. "You must be Michael Garrett," she said, rising from behind her desk to shake his hand. "I've been wondering when you might find your way to my office." "You know who I am?" She gestured for him to take a seat, giving Shadow an approving nod as the dog settled beside Michael's chair. "I make it my business to know when someone stands up to Harold Montgomery, especially someone who just purchased a property he's been trying to acquire for years." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me what's happened so far." Michael provided a concise summary of events since his arrival, discovering the shed, learning about William Morrison, the confrontations with Harold, and the escalating intimidation tactics. He omitted certain details, like the coordinates in the rings and the potential Blackwood fortune, until he could better gauge Rachel's trustworthiness. Rachel listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When he finished, she tapped her pen thoughtfully against the paper. "Harold's playing both sides of the street," she observed. "Official channels with the county inspection. unofficial muscle with the vandalism, classic tactics when he wants something badly. She looked up at Michael. The question is, what does he think you have that's worth this much effort? The land itself is valuable, but not enough to justify this level of attention. Michael hesitated, then decided to take a calculated risk. William Morrison was my great-grandfather. He left behind evidence that might contradict the official Blackwood, Montgomery history. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. Now that would certainly explain Harold's interest. His entire identity is built around being the Blackwood heir. His development projects, his standing in the community, even his personal relationships, they all leverage that legacy. She leaned forward. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Letters, photographs, architectural drawings, proof that William was forced to flee after his relationship with Catherine Blackwood was discovered. And possibly, Michael paused, weighing his next words carefully, possibly information about the missing Blackwood fortune. This clearly caught Rachel's attention. The missing fortune? That's been a local legend for generations. Edward Blackwood's mysterious wealth that vanished after his death. She studied Michael with renewed interest. And you believe William Morrison knew where it went? I believe Catherine may have told him, or even helped him secure it before he was forced to leave. Rachel was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. This changes the dynamics considerably. We're not just talking about a property dispute anymore. If there's actual treasure involved, historical artifacts, valuables, whatever form it takes, then legally, it becomes much more complex. How so? Montana law has specific provisions for historical discoveries and treasure troves. Depending on when it was hidden, how it was acquired, and who had legal claim to it originally, ownership could be contested by multiple parties, including the state itself. Michael hadn't considered that possibility. So even if I defend my property rights successfully, I might not have claim to whatever is hidden there. Potentially, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Rachel tapped her pen again, a habit when she was thinking. First priority is securing your immediate legal position. Harold's likely building a case around zoning violations, historical preservation requirements, or some other regulatory angle to force you off the land or into a protracted legal battle he can win through attrition. What do you suggest? Document everything, the vandalism, any threats, all communication with Harold or county officials. I'll file for an emergency injunction to prevent any interference with your property while ownership is being clarified. She paused. And I would strongly advise finding whatever William hid as quickly as possible. Once it's discovered, we have more options for protecting it. Michael nodded, feeling a sense of urgency building. What about the men who destroyed my campsite? Should I file a police report? Rachel's smile was tinged with resignation. You could, but the sheriff is Harold's golf buddy. Unless you have clear evidence linking the vandals to Harold, it would be dismissed as routine criminal mischief. She hesitated, then added, this town has complicated loyalties. The Montgomery influence runs deep in official channels, but there are plenty of residents who resent that influence. People whose families were here before the Blackwoods and Montgomerys, people who've had their own run-ins with Harold over the years. Like Frank at the hardware store? Exactly. Frank's grandfather used to own timber rights that the Montgomerys acquired under questionable circumstances during the Depression. There are dozens of similar stories throughout the community. Rachel's expression became more determined, which means you are not as alone in this fight as Harold wants you to believe. The conversation with Rachel had provided Michael with both tactical legal advice and a broader perspective on the community dynamics in Whitefish. Harold's power was substantial but not absolute. There were potential allies, people with their own reasons to see Harold's narrative challenged. As Michael prepared to leave, Rachel asked one final question. What's your end game here, Michael? What do you actually want to achieve? The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on defending against Harold's aggression and solving William's puzzle that he hadn't fully articulated his longer-term objectives. I want the truth acknowledged, he finally said. William Morrison was erased from history, his contributions stolen, his relationship with Catherine buried. Whatever else happens, that needs to be corrected. Rachel nodded approvingly. A matter of justice then, not just personal gain. Yes, though I won't pretend I'm not curious about what William and Catherine might have hidden. Fair enough. Rachel stood, extending her hand. I'll start the legal work immediately. In the meantime, be careful out there. Harold doesn't like losing, and he's never faced a challenge quite like this before. As Michael left the law office, he felt both more prepared and more aware of the stakes. This wasn't just about property rights or even hidden treasure. It was about rectifying a historical injustice, about bringing truth to light after decades of deliberate concealment. With Shadow beside him, Michael headed toward his truck, his mind already turning to the next step in deciphering William's puzzle. The coordinates from the rings needed to be verified, and the coded measurements in the blueprints demanded further analysis. Whatever William and Catherine had hidden, it was clear they had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it would eventually be found, but only by someone who understood the clues and had the determination to follow them. The Montana afternoon was fading toward evening, the October air growing sharper with approaching night. Michael knew he needed to act quickly. Harold's tactics would only escalate, and the window for uncovering William's legacy was closing. With renewed resolve, he turned his truck toward the hardware store. He would need additional supplies for what came next, tools for excavation, better lighting, and perhaps most importantly, a way to document whatever he found. The coordinates hidden in the rings pointed to a location on his property, but pinpointing it precisely would require careful measurement and mapping. If William had gone to such lengths to encode the location, whatever was hidden there must be significant, perhaps the key to the entire mystery. As he drove, Michael caught sight of Harold's black SUV parked outside the town's most expensive restaurant. Through the window, he could see Harold dining with what appeared to be county officials, their animated conversations suggesting business rather than pleasure. Harold was consolidating his position, leveraging his influence to build a case against Michael. It was a reminder that time was not on Michael's side. He needed to uncover William's secret before Harold found a way to legally block his access to the property, or worse, destroy the evidence altogether. The race to uncover the truth had begun in earnest. The forest at night was alive with sound and shadow, the autumn wind whispering through pine needles as Michael and Shadow made their careful way across the property. A three-quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate by, supplemented by the narrow beam of Michael's flashlight, kept pointed downward to avoid detection from a distance. In his backpack, Michael carried the tools he'd need: a handheld GPS unit, a compact metal detector, a collapsible shovel, and a digital camera with night vision capability. The coordinates from the combined rings had been programmed into the GPS, guiding him toward what he hoped would be the culmination of William Morrison's elaborate puzzle. Shadow moved ahead, his senses far more acute than any technology. The dog had proven invaluable throughout this unfolding mystery, his instincts seemingly attuned to William's legacy in ways that defied simple explanation. More than once, Michael had wondered if there was something almost supernatural about Shadow's connection to this place and its secrets. The GPS led them deeper into the wooded section of the property, away from both the shed and the area where Michael had set up his ill-fated campsite. As they approached the target coordinates, the terrain began to change, the relatively flat woodland giving way to a slight rise, a natural hillock that would be easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. Shadow's behavior changed as they neared the top of the rise. The dog's pace quickened, his nose working frantically as he circled a particular spot, then looked back at Michael with unmistakable excitement. They had arrived. The GPS confirmed they were within 3 meters of the exact coordinates. Michael set down his backpack and removed the metal detector, sweeping it in careful arcs across the ground. Almost immediately, the device emitted a strong signal, indicating a substantial metal object beneath the surface. "Good boy," Michael murmured to Shadow, who sat watching with alert anticipation. "Let's see what your great-grandfather left for us." The soil was surprisingly easy to dig, less compacted than the surrounding earth. Within minutes, Michael's shovel struck something solid, not the dull thud of stone, but the more resonant sound of metal striking metal. He cleared away more soil, revealing the curved top of what appeared to be a metal container. As he excavated further, the object took shape, a military-style ammunition box, the kind used to store artillery shells during World War II. It was roughly 2 feet long, a foot wide, and a foot deep, constructed of heavy-gauge steel with sturdy clasps on the front. The box had been wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, protecting it from moisture and corrosion over the decades. Michael carefully lifted it from its resting place, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside had significant heft. He placed it on level ground and used his knife to cut through the wax seal and oilcloth wrapping, revealing the box itself, olive drab with faded stenciling, indicating it had once held 75mm artillery shells for an M1A1 howitzer. The clasps were stiff but functional. Michael hesitated before opening them, aware that he was about to breach a time capsule that had waited nearly 80 years for this moment. Shadow whined softly beside him, impatient with the delay. "All right," Michael said, as much to himself as to Shadow. "Let's see what was worth all this trouble." He flipped the clasps and lifted the lid. Inside, protected by more oilcloth, was a stack of documents on top of something bulkier. Michael carefully removed the documents first, setting them aside to examine the larger object beneath. It was a leather satchel, its surface still supple thanks to the careful preservation. A brass plate on the front bore a single word, Blackwood. With growing anticipation, Michael opened the satchel. Inside was wealth beyond expectation, not just gold coins and jewelry, though those were present in abundance, but stock certificates, bearer bonds, and land deeds. Even to Michael's untrained eye, it was clearly worth millions. This was the missing Blackwood fortune, hidden away for generations. But it was the documents that truly captured Michael's attention. The top paper was a letter dated October 17, 1942, written in the same hand as William's previous correspondence. "To the finder of this legacy, if you are reading this, you have solved the puzzle I created to protect Catherine's inheritance from those who would misuse it. I have returned to Whitefish under grave risk to establish this final record of truth. The contents of this box represent the true Blackwood legacy, not merely wealth, but justice." Edward Blackwood, unlike his son James, was a man of principle. Before his death, he entrusted Catherine with the family's most valuable assets, foreseeing James's moral weakness and fearing for the future of all he had built. "When Catherine and I were forced apart, she insisted I take these assets for safekeeping. I have held them in trust all these years, waiting for the right moment to return them to their rightful place. That moment never came during our lifetimes. It is my hope that whoever finds this, likely one of my descendants, given the nature of my safeguards, will use this legacy as Catherine and I intended, to restore truth and create something meaningful where greed and deception once prevailed. The accompanying documents provide legal proof of ownership and the true history that has been suppressed. Use them wisely." With faith in the future, William Morrison, Walter Garrett. Michael set the letter aside with trembling hands, turning to the other documents. They included Edward Blackwood's original will, naming Catherine as his primary heir, legal documents establishing Catherine's transfer of assets to William, and a detailed account of the events surrounding William's forced departure, written by Catherine herself and notarized in secret. Most damning of all was a signed confession from James Blackwood, dated 1947, acknowledging his orchestration of the workshop fire and the threats used to drive William away. Apparently, in his later years, James had been consumed by guilt and written this confession, though he never had the courage to make it public. Together, these documents completely upended the narrative Harold Montgomery had built his identity upon. They revealed that the Montgomery family had never been legitimate heirs to the Blackwood fortune. They were usurpers who had maintained their position through deception and intimidation. As Michael carefully repacked the documents and valuables, the magnitude of his discovery settled over him. This wasn't just about vindicating William Morrison or claiming an inheritance. This was explosive information that would rewrite local history and potentially destroy the Montgomery empire Harold had built. No wonder Harold had been so desperate to acquire this land and eliminate any trace of William Morrison's legacy. Somewhere along the line, perhaps through Thomas, perhaps through other sources, he had learned enough to suspect that evidence existed that could threaten everything he had. Michael secured the ammunition box in his backpack, the weight substantial but manageable. He refilled the hole, carefully disguising the disturbed earth, then took several photographs of the site and its surroundings for documentation. Whatever happened next, he wanted irrefutable evidence of where and how this discovery had been made. As they made their way back through the moonlit forest, Michael's mind raced with the implications. The legal complexities Rachel had mentioned now seemed even more significant. This wasn't just buried treasure. It was a contested inheritance with documented provenance, complicated by nearly a century of concealment and false claims. Shadow suddenly froze, ears alert, body tense. A moment later, Michael heard it too, the distant sound of vehicles approaching on the access road. He checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. No legitimate visitor would arrive at this hour. They changed direction, moving away from both the access road and the path back to the shed. Michael's military training kicked in automatically. Assess terrain, identify cover, plan multiple exit routes. The property's topography offered natural advantages for evasion, with its varied elevation and dense undergrowth providing ample concealment. Through gaps in the trees, Michael caught glimpses of headlights, at least 3 vehicles moving slowly up the road, their beams sweeping the landscape. This wasn't a casual intimidation visit like before. This was a coordinated search operation. Michael and Shadow took position behind a fallen log on a ridge overlooking the clearing. From this vantage point, they could observe without being seen. 2 pickup trucks and a familiar black SUV came into view, stopping near where Michael's campsite had been. Harold Montgomery emerged from the SUV, directing the other men with authoritative gestures. There were 6 men total, all carrying flashlights and what appeared to be tools: shovels, picks, metal detectors. They spread out in a deliberate search pattern, moving toward the area where the shed stood. Harold remained by the vehicles, consulting what looked like a map or diagram. The systematic nature of the search confirmed Michael's suspicions. Harold had somehow learned about the hidden treasure, or at least suspected its existence strongly enough to mount this nighttime operation. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Something had tipped him off. Michael weighed his options. The ammunition box in his backpack contained everything needed to prove his claims and challenge Harold's position, but it was also heavy and would slow his movement. If they were discovered, escape would be difficult, and he had no illusions about what might happen if Harold's men caught him with the evidence that could destroy their employer. The safest course was to leave the property entirely, take the discovery directly to Rachel, and let legal mechanisms secure his position. But that would mean abandoning the shed and its contents to Harold's men, who would undoubtedly destroy anything they found. Shadow made the decision for him, tugging gently at Michael's sleeve before moving purposefully through the trees, away from both the searchers and the road. The dog's instincts had proven reliable throughout this adventure. Michael chose to trust them again. They made their way carefully through the forest, paralleling the access road, but staying well concealed within the tree line. Shadow led with confidence, as if following a path only he could perceive. After about 20 minutes of cautious progress, they emerged near where Michael had parked his truck, hidden on a disused logging track half a mile from the main property entrance. The vehicle was untouched, no signs of tampering or surveillance. Michael loaded Shadow in the precious backpack inside, then started the engine, keeping the headlights off as he carefully navigated the rough track by moonlight. Only when they reached the county road did he switch on the lights, accelerating away from the property and toward the relative safety of Whitefish. But where to go? It was well past midnight now, and while Rachel had given Michael her cell number, calling her at this hour seemed extreme. Additionally, he didn't want to risk going to her office or home, as Harold might have them watched. The decision was made for him when he spotted police lights in his rearview mirror. A patrol car had pulled out behind him and was closing the distance, lights flashing but sirens silent. Michael considered his options, quickly deciding that attempting to outrun the police would only make his situation worse. He pulled over, heart pounding. The patrol car stopped behind him, its spotlight illuminating the truck's interior. Michael kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, Shadow sitting calmly beside him. The officer approached cautiously, flashlight beam playing across the vehicle before settling on Michael's face. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone professionally neutral. Michael complied, retrieving the documents with slow, deliberate movements. "Mr. Garrett?" the officer said, examining the license. "I'm Officer Wilson. Mind telling me what you're doing out this late?" "Just heading back to town," Michael replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report of trespassing and possible theft in this area." The officer's flashlight moved to the backpack on the passenger floor. Mind telling me what's in the bag? Before Michael could answer, a familiar voice called from behind the patrol car. Everything all right, Abe? Rachel Hamilton approached, her own car parked behind the police cruiser. She was dressed casually in jeans and a fleece jacket, as if she'd left home in a hurry. Officer Wilson straightened. Ms. Hamilton, this is police business. And Mr. Garrett is my client, Rachel replied smoothly. I'd like to know on what grounds you've stopped him. As I was explaining, we received a report of trespassing. On whose property? Rachel challenged. Because Mr. Garrett is the legal owner of the land he's been occupying. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The call came from Mr. Montgomery. He claimed unauthorized individuals were on property he has a legal claim to. A claim that hasn't been validated by any court, Rachel countered. Unless you have specific evidence of a crime, this stop appears to be harassment of my client at the behest of a third party with a personal agenda. Officer Wilson hesitated, clearly weighing his options. I need to see what's in the backpack. Do you have a warrant? Rachel asked. I have reasonable suspicion. Based on an unsubstantiated claim from Harold Montgomery, Rachel interrupted. That's not sufficient for a search, and I think we both know it. The standoff lasted several tense seconds before Officer Wilson relented, handing back Michael's license and registration. I'm going to let you go with a warning this time, Mr. Garrett, but I suggest you sort out this property dispute legally before things escalate. That's exactly what we're doing, Rachel assured him, her tone professional but firm. Once the patrol car had departed, Rachel approached Michael's window. Follow me, she said quietly. We need to talk somewhere safe. 20 minutes later, they were seated at Rachel's kitchen table, the contents of the ammunition box spread before them. Her small cottage on the outskirts of town offered privacy and security, away from curious eyes. Shadow had settled comfortably on a rug by the fireplace, apparently at ease in these new surroundings. Rachel examined the documents with growing amazement, her legal mind instantly grasping their significance. This is extraordinary, she breathed, carefully turning the pages of Catherine's account. Not just the historical value, but the legal implications. This completely undermines the Montgomery claim to the Blackwood assets. How did you know to find me tonight? Michael asked, the question that had been on his mind since her timely arrival. Rachel looked up from the documents. Thomas Blackwood called me. He said Harold had suddenly become agitated this evening, making calls, gathering men. Thomas overheard enough to realize Harold was planning some kind of operation on your property. She paused. He also mentioned you might have found something significant. Thomas called you? I didn't realize you knew each other. I've represented him in several matters over the years, Rachel explained, mostly helping protect what little independence he has from Harold's control. He's one of the few people who knows the full history of the Blackwood-Montgomery dynamics. She returned her attention to the documents. This confession from James Blackwood is particularly significant. Combined with Edward's original will and the asset transfer documents, it creates an unbroken chain of legal ownership from Edward to Catherine to William. She looked up at Michael, and presumably from William to his heirs, which would be you. What about the state's claim you mentioned? Historical artifacts and treasure troves? These aren't random artifacts, Rachel said, tapping the papers. This is a documented inheritance with clear provenance. The fact that it was hidden doesn't change the ownership, especially since we can prove it was concealed due to coercion and threats. She smiled slightly. In legal terms, this is about as close to a slam dunk as inheritance cases get. So what happens now? Rachel carefully gathered the documents, returning them to their protective covering. First, we secure these in my law office safe. Then, first thing tomorrow, we file for an emergency injunction preventing Harold from accessing your property on any pretense. We'll also need to formally register these discoveries with the county recorder and possibly the State Historical Society. She paused, considering. Harold's going to fight this with everything he has, not just for the material value, but because it undermines his entire identity and standing in the community. We should be prepared for legal counterattacks, public relations smears, possibly even more direct threats. I'm not backing down, Michael said firmly. William and Catherine went through too much to preserve this truth. I won't let it be buried again. Rachel nodded approvingly. That's the spirit we'll need. She glanced at her watch. It's nearly 2 a.m. You should stay here tonight. The guest room is small but comfortable, and I think we'd both feel better knowing Harold's men aren't going to make another attempt to find you before morning. The offer made sense from both a practical and safety perspective. Michael accepted gratefully, the weight of the day's discoveries and confrontations suddenly pressing down on him. Shadow followed him to the guest room, settling on the rug beside the bed with a contented sigh. Despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Michael's mind kept returning to William and Catherine's story, their love, their separation, their decades-long effort to preserve both truth and treasure for future generations. He thought about his own grandfather, raised in Chicago by a father who had lost everything but his integrity. How different would their lives have been if William had been able to claim his rightful place in Whitefish society? If Catherine had been free to follow her heart? The injustice echoed across generations, shaping lives in ways both subtle and profound. Michael himself had grown up disconnected from his family history, with only vague stories and his grandfather's ring as links to a past he hadn't understood. That disconnection had influenced his own life choices, perhaps even his decision to join the military, seeking structure and belonging he hadn't found elsewhere. Now the circle was closing. By pure chance, or perhaps something more meaningful, he had found his way back to the land where it all began, uncovering a legacy that had waited patiently for its moment of revelation. Morning brought a flurry of activity. Rachel was already working when Michael emerged from the guest room, legal documents spread across her dining table as she prepared their case. After a quick breakfast, they headed to her office, the ammunition box and its precious contents secured in Rachel's car. The law office was quiet, only the receptionist present when they arrived. Rachel immediately moved to secure the documents and valuables in her office safe, then began preparing the legal filings that would protect Michael's position and formally establish his claim to William's legacy. "We should expect Harold to respond quickly once these are filed," she warned as she worked. "His influence with local officials means he'll be notified almost immediately." "What's his most likely move?" Michael asked. "Legally? Probably a counterclaim challenging your ownership of the property itself. He'll use the county inspection from yesterday to allege code violations, historical preservation issues, whatever technicalities he can find." Rachel continued typing without looking up. "Less legally? That's harder to predict. But based on his escalating tactics so far, I wouldn't rule anything out." Michael nodded, absently scratching behind Shadow's ears as the dog sat beside him. "I should check on the shed. If Harold's men searched the property last night, they might have found it." "Too risky," Rachel cautioned. "Until we have the injunction in place, going back there could give Harold an excuse to have you arrested for trespassing. Despite your clear ownership, he's already tried once with that police stop." "But the shed contains more evidence. The blueprints, the other crates, if Harold destroys those..." Rachel paused her typing, considering. "You're right. That evidence strengthens our case." She glanced at her watch. "The courthouse opens in 20 minutes. I can file the injunction paperwork immediately, then we could potentially visit the property with legal protection in place." The plan was sound, but events intervened before they could implement it. Rachel's phone rang. Yeah. Rang. Thomas Blackwood calling with urgent news. "Harold's men are at the property now," Rachel reported after a brief conversation. "They found the shed and are removing items. Thomas heard Harold giving orders to clean out that old shack early this morning." Michael stood immediately, anger flooding through him. "We need to stop them." "Agreed. I'll call the sheriff's office, report illegal removal of property. It may not stop them completely, but it could slow them down until we get the injunction." Rachel was already dialing. "You stay here. If you confront Harold directly, it could complicate our legal position." But Michael couldn't sit idle while William's legacy was being dismantled. "I'll be careful," he promised, already moving toward the door, Shadow at his heels. "But I need to document what they're doing, at minimum. Visual evidence of theft will strengthen our case." Rachel clearly wanted to argue but was now speaking with the sheriff's dispatcher. She covered the phone briefly. "Don't engage directly. Just document from a distance, then come right back here." Michael nodded and left quickly, his truck eating up the miles to the property. As he drove, he formulated a plan. He wouldn't confront Harold or his men directly. Rachel was right about the legal risks. But he needed visual evidence of their activities and, if possible, to assess what had already been taken from the shed. Approaching the property, Michael parked well before the main access road, concealing his truck behind a stand of trees. He and Shadow would move through the forest on foot, using the terrain for concealment as they had the previous night. The sounds of activity guided them, engines running, men's voices carrying through the clear morning air. Michael approached cautiously, Shadow moving silently beside him, until they reached a vantage point overlooking the clearing around the shed. The scene confirmed their worst fears. Harold was personally supervising as four men systematically emptied the shed of its contents. The wooden crates Michael had discovered were being loaded into pickup trucks, along with the workbench, tools, and even sections of the wooden walls that had concealed the hidden compartments. Michael quietly took out his phone, recording video of the operation from his concealed position. Harold was clearly visible, directing the removal and occasionally examining items of particular interest. The evidence was damning, a wealthy, influential man personally orchestrating what amounted to theft and destruction of historical artifacts. As Michael watched, Harold held up what appeared to be one of the blueprints, examining it briefly before folding it and placing it in a leather portfolio. His expression was tense, his movements hurried, a man racing against time, knowing his actions might soon be challenged legally. Shadow suddenly tensed beside Michael, a low growl building in his throat. Before Michael could quiet him, the dog darted forward, breaking cover and racing toward the clearing with surprising speed. Harold's men shouted in alarm as the German Shepherd charged into their midst, heading directly for Harold himself. Michael had no choice but to follow, all thoughts of remaining hidden abandoned as he ran after Shadow. By the time he reached the clearing, chaos had erupted. Shadow hadn't attacked Harold but was instead tugging at the leather portfolio, trying to wrest it from the man's grip. Harold's security men were converging, one drawing a weapon. "Shadow, stop!" Michael shouted, fear for his dog overriding all other concerns. Everyone froze at his voice. Harold, still gripping the portfolio with one hand while fending off Shadow with the other, turned with an expression of mingled surprise and triumph. "Mr. Garrett," he said, his voice strained but controlled, "your dog seems quite interested in my property." "It's not your property," Michael replied, approaching cautiously, eyes on the man with the drawn gun. "None of this is, and I have video evidence of you removing items from my land without permission." Harold's smile was cold. "Your land? I think you'll find the legal situation is more complex than that. This structure, for instance, violates at least 6 county building codes and stands in violation of historical preservation statutes. As a concerned citizen and historical society board member, I'm simply securing artifacts at risk of damage or loss." It was a practiced explanation, likely the same one he would offer to any official who questioned his actions. But Michael wasn't deterred. "Call off your man," he said, nodding toward the security guard still aiming at Shadow, "or this concerned citizen act goes public along with a video of armed men threatening a service dog." Harold hesitated, then nodded slightly. The guard lowered his weapon but remained vigilant. "Shadow," Michael called firmly, "come." To his relief, Shadow released the portfolio and returned to his side, though the dog's attention remained fixed on Harold, body tense and ready. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in," Harold said, his public persona slipping to reveal genuine anger. "This goes beyond property rights or historical curiosities." "I know exactly what I'm involved in," Michael countered. "William Morrison was my great-grandfather. Catherine Blackwoods sent her son, my grandfather, to him after they were forced apart. I know about James Blackwood's threats, the workshop fire, all of it." Harold's expression flickered with something like fear before hardening again. "Stories and speculation. You have no proof." "I have Edward Blackwood's original will naming Catherine his heir. I have James Blackwood's signed confession about driving William away. And I have documentation of Catherine transferring the Blackwood assets to William for safekeeping, assets that legally now belong to me." The color drained from Harold's face. For a moment, he seemed genuinely staggered. Then his composure returned, harder and colder than before. "Where?" he demanded. "Where did you find these supposed documents?" "Safe with my attorney," Michael replied, "along with the Blackwood fortune that William and Catherine preserved." The confrontation might have escalated further, but the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted them. 2 Sheriff's Department cruisers appeared on the access road, lights flashing. Rachel's call had worked. Law enforcement was responding. Harold quickly adjusted his demeanor, straightening his jacket and adopting a more dignified posture. "This isn't over, Garrett," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." As the deputies approached, Michael knew Harold was right about one thing. This confrontation was just the beginning. The battle for William Morrison's legacy and for justice, long delayed, was only now truly beginning. The arrival of the sheriff's deputies transformed the clearing into a tense standoff. Two uniformed officers approached cautiously, taking in the scene. Harold and his men, surrounded by crates and artifacts, Michael and Shadow standing apart, the partially dismantled shed behind them. "What's going on here?" asked the lead deputy, a weathered man in his 50s whose nameplate identified him as Reynolds. Harold stepped forward smoothly. "Just a misunderstanding, deputy. My historical preservation team is securing artifacts from this unsafe structure." He gestured toward the shed. "Mr. Garrett here seems confused about property regulations." Michael held up his phone. "I have video of them removing items from my property without permission. This is theft, plain and simple." Deputy Reynolds looked between them, his expression revealing nothing. "Ownership of this property is currently under dispute, from what I understand." "There is no legitimate dispute," Michael insisted. "I have clear title. Mr. Montgomery is trespassing and stealing historical artifacts." Harold scoffed. "These items fall under historical preservation statutes. As chairman of the County Historical Society, I have authority to secure at-risk artifacts." The deputy sighed, clearly recognizing the complex situation. "Here's what's going to happen. Everyone's going to step back. No more items leave this property until ownership and preservation jurisdiction are formally established." He turned to Harold. "Mr. Montgomery, your team needs to leave what they haven't already loaded." Harold began to protest, but the deputy held up a hand. "This isn't negotiable, sir. We'll inventory what's already in the vehicles, and it will be held as evidence until a judge makes a determination." It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to halt the immediate destruction. As the deputies began cataloging the items, Michael's phone rang, Rachel calling for an update. "The sheriff's deputies are here," he reported quietly. "They've stopped the removal for now." "Good timing," Rachel replied. "I just filed the emergency injunction. Judge Keller granted it immediately. No activity permitted on the property by anyone except the legal owner until ownership is conclusively determined. I'm on my way with the signed order now." Michael ended the call feeling more confident. The legal wheels were turning in their favor. Harold seemed to sense it too, his expression darkening as he conferred with his security team. The next hour unfolded with tense efficiency. Rachel arrived with the injunction, presenting it to the deputies with professional courtesy. The document explicitly prohibited Harold or his representatives from entering the property or removing any items. More significantly, it acknowledged Michael's current legal ownership while noting Harold's challenge would be heard in court. "This is just a temporary measure," Harold said dismissively as he read the order. "A minor delay." "Perhaps," Rachel replied, "but it means everything stays exactly where it is until a judge rules. And I think you'll find the evidence strongly favors my client." Harold's smile was cold. "Evidence can be interpreted many ways, Miss Hamilton, and judges can be persuaded." "Are you suggesting you plan to improperly influence the court?" Rachel asked, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the deputies overheard. Harold's expression tightened. "I'm suggesting that the full context of this situation is more complex than your client understands." He turned to Michael. "This isn't just about property or historical artifacts. This is about legacy, something I don't expect a rootless veteran with no connection to this community to comprehend." The words were calculated to sting, but Michael remained unmoved. "My roots go deeper than yours, Montgomery. William Morrison helped build this town before your grandfather forced him out. That's the legacy I'm protecting." Harold didn't respond directly, instead turning to the deputies. "I expect these items to be properly secured. They represent significant historical value to this community." "We'll handle it by the book, sir," Deputy Reynolds assured him, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sympathetic to Harold's position. With the injunction in force and deputies supervising, Harold had no choice but to retreat. He left with a final warning look at Michael, his security team following in a separate vehicle. The trucks containing items already removed from the shed remained behind, their contents now under police custody. Once Harold was gone, Deputy Reynolds approached Michael and Rachel. You two have kicked a hornet's nest, he observed, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. Montgomery isn't used to being challenged. We're just protecting legitimate property rights, Rachel replied. Reynolds nodded. Maybe so, but you should know, Montgomery's influence runs deep around here. Not everyone in uniform is going to play this straight. He glanced toward his partner, who was inventorying crates some distance away. Watch yourselves. The warning was unexpected. A small crack in what Michael had assumed was universal support for Harold among local officials. Appreciated, he said simply. With the immediate crisis averted, Michael and Rachel took stock of the situation. The shed had been partially dismantled, but much of its contents remained, including several crates Harold's men hadn't yet removed. The deputies would maintain a presence until everything was properly documented, providing temporary security against further intrusion. We should examine what's left, Michael suggested. There might be additional evidence to strengthen our case. Rachel agreed, and they entered what remained of the shed. Despite the damage, the hidden compartments in the walls and floor were largely intact. Harold's men had discovered some, but not all, of William's hiding places. In one previously untouched wall cavity, Michael found something unexpected. A small wooden box containing a stack of photographs unlike the formal portraits he'd seen earlier. These were intimate snapshots of Catherine and William together, their happiness evident despite the era's typically stoic photographic expressions. More surprisingly, there were later photographs showing Williams, now older and using the name Walter Garrett, with Catherine in what appeared to be secret meetings over the decades. They never stopped seeing each other, Michael realized, examining a photo dated 1947, more than 20 years after Williams supposedly disappeared. They maintained their connection throughout their lives, which explains how the documentation remained so comprehensive, Rachel noted. They were continually updating it, preparing for eventual discovery. The most poignant item was a photograph from what appeared to be the 1950s, showing an elderly William with a young man who must have been Michael's grandfather, Walter Jr. They stood proudly before a construction project, the Chicago skyline visible in the background. On the back was written, Walter and Jr. completing the Lakeside Tower, our most significant project yet. Catherine would be proud of her grandson following the family tradition. Michael stared at the image, this tangible connection to ancestors he'd never known. His grandfather had died before Michael was born, his architectural legacy one of the few details passed down through family stories. Now the context of that legacy gained new meaning. It wasn't just a career, but a continuation of William Morrison's interrupted life's work. This adds a personal dimension to our case, Rachel observed. It's not just about property and assets. It's about a family deliberately torn apart, connections maintained against all odds. As they continued their examination, Shadow suddenly perked up, moving to a section of flooring that appeared undisturbed. His behavior was reminiscent of their earlier discoveries, the same focused intensity that had led them to each new revelation. Michael followed the dog's lead, carefully examining the floorboards. They appeared ordinary, but when pressed in sequence, a small section shifted, revealing yet another hidden compartment. Inside was a slim metal tube, the kind architects used to protect important drawings. The tube contained a single large document, not a blueprint this time, but a detailed map of Whitefish and surrounding areas as they existed in the 1920s. Various properties were marked with William's distinctive handwriting, most notably a large area encompassing not just Michael's current land, but significant portions of what was now Harold's prized development site. This is the original Blackwood grant, Rachel said, examining the notations. Edward Blackwood's initial land holdings before they were divided among various entities. She pointed to a particular marking. And this appears to be William's original proof of ownership, signed by Edward himself, not James. Why is that significant? Because if Edward directly granted this land to William before his death, it bypasses James's later manipulations entirely. It would mean William's ownership was established independently of his relationship with Catherine, and it would invalidate every subsequent transfer, including those that eventually led to Harold's developments. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about Michael's 40 acres or even the missing Blackwood fortune. This document potentially challenged ownership of hundreds of acres of prime Montana real estate, land now worth tens of millions as part of Harold's luxury developments. No wonder Harold's been so aggressive, Michael said. He must have suspected something like this existed. This changes our strategy, Rachel admitted, carefully returning the map to its protective tube. We're not just defending your property rights now. We're potentially challenging Harold's entire empire. The stakes had grown exponentially, and with them, the danger. Harold Montgomery had built his identity and fortune on land that might never have legitimately belonged to his family. People had committed desperate acts for far less. As if confirming this thought, Michael's phone rang. Thomas Blackwood calling, his voice urgent and strained. Harold just left the care center, the old man reported. He was different, cold. He asked questions about Catherine's journals, about meetings with William after the fire. Thomas paused, his breathing labored. I think he knows I've been helping you. He made threats, not directly, but clear enough. Said it was unfortunate how memory fails in old age and how accidents happen to the elderly all the time. We'll get you out of there, Michael promised immediately. Today. It's not that simple, Thomas replied. This place is all I have, and Harold's made sure I have nowhere else to go. Michael looked at Rachel, who nodded understanding. Mr. Blackwood, she said, taking the phone, this is Rachel Hamilton. I can file for emergency protective custody based on these threats. We can have you relocated to a secure facility within hours. The legal mechanisms moved swiftly after that. Rachel's connections at Adult Protective Services, combined with Thomas's statement about Harold's veiled threats, secured an emergency transfer order. By late afternoon, Thomas had been moved to a facility in Kalispell, beyond Harold's immediate influence. The day's victories, however, came with a sobering recognition. Harold was escalating, becoming more desperate and potentially more dangerous as his carefully constructed narrative unraveled. We need to move quickly now, Rachel advised as they left the Protective Services office. File our comprehensive claim, get all the evidence before a judge, and secure formal recognition of your ownership before Harold can mobilize his political connections. The courthouse was closing for the day, but Rachel's reputation secured them an after-hours appointment with Judge Keller, a stern woman in her 60s known for her independence from local politics. In her chambers, Rachel presented the core evidence: the original Blackwood will, James's confession, the asset transfer documents, and most critically, the newly discovered map showing Edward Blackwood's direct grant to William Morrison. Judge Keller examined each document carefully, her expression revealing nothing. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured but decisive. This warrants an expanded injunction, she determined. No development activity on any lands potentially affected by these ownership questions until a full hearing can be conducted. She fixed Rachel with a penetrating look. You understand what you are challenging here? Montgomery Developments is the largest employer in the county. This will affect hundreds of lives. We understand, Your Honor, Rachel replied. But legal ownership can't be determined by economic impact. Judge Keller nodded almost approvingly. True enough. I'll issue the expanded order immediately and schedule an expedited hearing for next week. She turned her attention to Michael. Mr. Garrett, I suggest you secure these documents and yourself. Montgomery won't take this lightly. The warning proved prophetic. As Michael and Rachel left the courthouse, a local news crew was already waiting, clearly tipped off about the filing. Harold had moved quickly to take the battle public. Mr. Garrett, called the reporter, a polished woman in her 30s. Is it true you're challenging ownership of half the developed property in Whitefish based on century-old documents? How do you respond to accusations that this is an opportunistic lawsuit against a respected community leader? Rachel stepped forward smoothly. My client has discovered legitimate historical documentation that raises serious questions about property transfers dating back to the 1920s. We're simply asking the court to examine the evidence and make a proper determination. No further comment at this time. The media ambush was just the beginning. By nightfall, local news websites were running stories with headlines like "Outsider Challenges Montgomery Legacy" and "Development Projects Halted by Historical Claim." The framing was predictably slanted in Harold's favor, portraying Michael as an opportunistic stranger disrupting the community's economic lifeblood. This is just the opening salvo, Rachel warned as they reviewed the coverage from her office. Harold has decades of community goodwill and significant media connections. He's trying to turn public opinion against you before the legal merits are even heard. Michael nodded, unsurprised. Standard tactic. Discredit the messenger when you can't discredit the message. They worked late into the evening, organizing evidence and preparing for the inevitable legal counterattack. Harold would undoubtedly file motions challenging the injunction, questioning the authenticity of the documents, and attempting to limit the scope of their claims. Around midnight, Michael finally left Rachel's office, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. Shadow padded faithfully beside him as they walked to his truck. The streets of Whitefish nearly deserted at this hour. The first indication of trouble was subtle, a dark sedan passing too slowly, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. Michael registered it automatically, his combat-honed senses picking up the anomaly without conscious thought. He changed direction, cutting through an alley rather than continuing to the parking lot where his truck waited. The sedan reappeared at the alley's far end, blocking the exit. Behind him, footsteps sounded, multiple individuals moving with purpose. Shadow growled, positioning himself between Michael and the approaching threat. "Mr. Garrett," called a voice from the shadows. "Mr. Montgomery would like a private word." "He has my number," Michael replied evenly, assessing his options. The alley offered limited escape routes, but a recessed doorway to his right might provide momentary cover if things turned violent. 3 men emerged from the shadows behind him, while 2 more exited the sedan ahead. All wore dark clothing and moved with the coordinated precision of professionals. Not local muscle this time, but trained security personnel. "This isn't negotiable," said the apparent leader, a tall man with a military bearing Michael recognized instantly. Former special forces, most likely. The stance and vigilance were unmistakable. "Everything's negotiable," Michael countered, "but I don't discuss legal matters without my attorney present." "This isn't about legal matters," the man replied. "It's about understanding the consequences of your actions. People depend on Montgomery developments, their livelihoods, their futures. Your crusade has real-world impacts beyond whatever principle you think you're defending." It was a more sophisticated approach than brute intimidation, appealing to community impact, to collateral damage. But Michael recognized the underlying threat. If Montgomery is concerned about his employees, he should have considered that before building an empire on stolen land. The leader's expression hardened. "Last chance for a peaceful conversation, Garrett." Michael's response was cut short by Shadow's sudden alert bark, a warning different from his previous growls. The dog was facing the alley entrance behind the men, his posture indicating a new arrival. "Everything all right here?" came a familiar voice. Frank from the hardware store stood at the alley entrance, a shotgun held casually but visibly at his side. Behind him were several other figures, men and women of various ages, all watching the scene with evident concern. "Just a private conversation," the security leader replied smoothly. "Doesn't look private to me," Frank observed. "Looks like 5 against 1 in a dark alley after midnight." He stepped forward, others following. "Thing about small towns, we notice when strangers corner one of our own." The security team reassessed the situation quickly, their professional training evident in how they maintained formation while preparing to withdraw. Their leader gave Michael a final look. "This isn't over." "Never thought it was," Michael replied evenly. The men retreated to their vehicle, departing with controlled urgency. As they disappeared, Frank approached, the shotgun now pointed safely downward. "Figured you might need some friends tonight," he said, extending a hand. Word travels fast when someone finally stands up to Montgomery. Michael shook the offered hand, genuinely surprised by the intervention. "I appreciate it, though I'm hardly one of your own. I've only been here a few weeks." Frank chuckled. "You're more local than you realize. If you're William Morrison's kin, you've got deeper roots here than half the town." He gestured to the others who had accompanied him. "Plenty of families around here remember what the Montgomerys did to claim their position. Been waiting a long time for someone to challenge the official story." The support was unexpected but welcome. As Frank introduced the others, small business owners, teachers, ordinary citizens with their own reasons to resent Harold's influence, Michael began to understand that this wasn't just his personal battle. He had stumbled into a community's long-simmering resentment against power concentrated in too few hands. "We heard about the injunction, the land claim," said an older woman who owned the local bakery. About time someone questioned how the Montgomerys got all that property. Harold's been using his influence to push through developments nobody wants, added another man, a fishing guide who had lived in Whitefish his entire life. Pricing out locals, changing the character of the town. The impromptu gathering moved to a late-night diner where more townspeople joined them. Michael found himself at the center of a grassroots movement he'd never intended to start. People sharing stories of Montgomery intimidation, of historical properties demolished for luxury developments, of political maneuvering that always benefited Harold's interests above community needs. By the time Michael finally returned to Rachel's cottage, where he was temporarily staying for security, his perspective had shifted. What had begun as a personal quest to uncover his family history had evolved into something far more significant, a community's chance to reclaim its narrative from those who had controlled it for generations. The days leading up to the court hearing unfolded in a blur of legal preparation and mounting community tension. Harold's counteroffensive was comprehensive. Motions challenging the authenticity of the documents, attempts to disqualify Judge Keller for alleged bias, and a public relations campaign portraying Michael as an outsider manipulated by Rachel's personal vendetta against successful local businesses. More concerning were the whispered threats. Thomas reported that staff at his new facility had been approached with questions about his location. Rachel's office received anonymous calls warning of consequences if the case proceeded. Even Shadow wasn't immune. One morning, Michael found raw meat laced with broken glass near Rachel's fence, clearly intended for the dog to find. Yet for every intimidation tactic, there came unexpected support. Local business owners offered meeting space when Rachel's office received a bomb threat. A retired document examiner volunteered to authenticate Williams' papers. Even Deputy Reynolds discreetly shared information about Harold's communications with the sheriff's department. The morning of the hearing dawned crisp and clear, the October air carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The courthouse steps were crowded with spectators, some holding signs supporting Montgomery developments, others quietly nodding encouragement to Michael and Rachel as they ascended. Harold arrived in a luxury SUV, flanked by 3 attorneys and a public relations specialist, who immediately began briefing waiting reporters. His confidence was palpable, his handmade suit and practiced smile projecting absolute certainty in his position. "Remember," Rachel murmured as they approached the courtroom, "Harold's playing to the public gallery. Judge Keller cares about evidence, not theatrics." The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Judge Keller entered with brisk efficiency, her no-nonsense demeanor setting the tone immediately. "This preliminary hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with a full trial regarding the contested ownership claims," she announced. "Let me be clear. This is about legal title and documented provenance, not community impact or economic consequences. Those considerations may be relevant in other forums, but have no bearing on the legal questions before this court." Rachel presented their case first, a methodical exposition of the documents discovered in the shed and buried chest, tracing the chain of ownership from Edward Blackwood to William Morrison to Michael Garrett. The original map with Edward's grant to William was particularly compelling, as it established a direct transfer independent of any later manipulations. Harold's legal team countered with technical objections, questioning the chain of custody for the documents, challenging their authenticity based on alleged inconsistencies, and arguing that even if genuine, the statute of limitations had long expired for such claims. "Your Honor," argued Harold's lead attorney, a silver-haired man from a prestigious Helena firm, "even if we accept these documents at face value, which we emphatically do not, they represent claims that should have been brought decades ago. Mr. Morrison, if he felt wronged, had ample opportunity to pursue legal remedies during his lifetime." "A difficult proposition," Rachel countered, "when he was forced to flee under threat of false criminal charges, and when the very individuals who orchestrated his departure controlled local law enforcement and judiciary." The legal arguments continued for hours, technical and procedural points countered by moral and historical context. Throughout, Harold maintained a composed exterior, though Michael noticed his jaw tightening whenever William and Catherine's names were mentioned. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Judge Keller asked a final question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Montgomery, given the serious nature of these documents, particularly James Blackwood's signed confession, Are you prepared to submit to forensic examination of all relevant Montgomery family records to establish a definitive timeline of property transfers? Harold conferred briefly with his attorneys before responding. While we have nothing to hide, Your Honor, such an examination would constitute an undue burden on our business operations and violate proprietary information protected under various statutes. We would vigorously oppose any such order. Judge Keller's expression remained neutral, but Michael sensed her disapproval at the evasive answer. I'll take all arguments under advisement and issue my ruling on whether this case proceeds to trial within 48 hours, she announced, bringing the hearing to a close. Outside the courthouse, the opposing camps gathered on separate sides of the steps. Harold delivered a polished statement to the media about frivolous claims threatening community prosperity, while Rachel maintained their focus on the legal merits without engaging in public debate. As they descended the steps, Michael noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the street. Jennifer Lane, the real estate agent who had sold him the property. She had avoided all contact since the dispute became public, but now she moved purposefully toward him, her expression conflicted. "Mr. Garrett," she said quietly, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "there's something you should know. The property listing, it wasn't random chance that you found it." Michael studied her with sudden intensity. "What do you mean?" "I received specific instructions about that sale. The trust that owned the land, it had standing orders that if anyone named Garrett ever inquired about property in the area, that specific parcel was to be made available at below market value." She swallowed hard. "I never knew why until all this came out. It was set up decades ago with legal requirements to maintain absolute confidentiality." The revelation stunned Michael. His purchase hadn't been coincidence or fate. It had been orchestrated generations earlier, a path laid by William himself, ensuring that if any of his descendants ever returned to Whitefish, they would be guided to exactly the right place. "Who controlled the trust?" Rachel asked sharply. "That's just it," Jennifer replied. "The paperwork listed a Chicago law firm as trustee, but when I researched it for the closing, I discovered the firm was founded by Walter Garrett Sr. in the 1940s. She met Michael's gaze directly. "Your great-grandfather created a legal mechanism to preserve that land for his family, no matter how long it took." The piece clicked into place. Why the property had suddenly become available precisely when Michael was searching. Why Harold had been caught off guard by the sale. William had outmaneuvered his adversaries from beyond the grave, his foresight extending across nearly a century to create this moment of reckoning. Before Michael could fully process this information, commotion erupted at the top of the courthouse steps. Harold was engaged in heated conversation with his attorneys, his composure finally cracking as he gesticulated angrily. Through the open courthouse doors, Deputy Reynolds emerged, accompanied by 2 state police officers. "Harold Montgomery," called one of the state officers, "we need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding financial irregularities discovered during document review for this case." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Harold's face flushed with anger and something close to panic. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "I'm being targeted because of this lawsuit." "Actually, sir," the officer replied calmly, "this concerns evidence of tax fraud and document forgery discovered in records you submitted to the court. Judge Keller was legally obligated to report these discrepancies to the appropriate authorities." As Harold was escorted to a waiting police vehicle, his carefully constructed facade of respectability visibly crumbled. The community watched in stunned silence, witnessing the beginning of the end for a dynasty built on deception. 2 days later, Judge Keller issued her ruling. The case would proceed to full trial, all Montgomery development activities would remain suspended pending resolution, and the court would appoint independent forensic examiners to authenticate all disputed documents. More damaging for Harold, the ruling explicitly cited compelling preliminary evidence of deliberate historical falsification that warranted thorough investigation. For Michael, the legal victory was significant but secondary to the personal revelations. As he stood on his property, his legitimate inheritance, he felt a connection to William and Catherine that transcended time and separation. They had created this moment through decades of patient planning, preserving truth for future vindication. With shadow beside him, Michael surveyed the land stretching before him. The autumn colors painted the landscape in golds and reds, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. This place had called to him across generations, guided him home through mechanisms he was only beginning to understand. Rachel's car appeared on the access road, bringing news from the latest developments. Harold had been released on bail, but faced mounting legal troubles as investigations uncovered decades of financial improprieties. The Montgomery Empire was unraveling thread by thread, its foundation of lies exposed to public scrutiny. More importantly, the community was reclaiming its narrative. Local historians were already documenting William Morrison's architectural contributions, Catherine's secret resistance against her family's injustice, and the quiet courage of those who had preserved fragments of truth through generations of Montgomery dominance. "What will you do now?" Rachel asked as they walked the property, Shadow ranging ahead to explore familiar territory. The legal process could take months, even years. Michael gestured toward the remains of the shed. "I'm going to rebuild it first, preserve it as William intended, then eventually build the home he designed." He smiled slightly. Not the grand estate in the original blueprints, but something that honors his vision while serving a different purpose. What purpose? A place for veterans dealing with PTSD, somewhere quiet to heal, to reconnect with themselves. Michael looked across the landscape, seeing possibilities where once he had sought only isolation. William and Catherine lost decades together because of greed and social barriers. "I can't change that, but I can use their legacy to help people who've lost parts of themselves to violence and trauma." Rachel nodded approval. "They would have liked that, I think." "There's something else," Michael added, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, a preliminary design he'd been working on. The community center William designed but never built. Those measurements encoded in the blueprint, they weren't just coordinates for the treasure, they were specs for a public gathering place he wanted to create for Whitefish. The design incorporated elements from William's original vision, the distinctive roofline, the grand entrance, the careful integration with the natural landscape, but updated for modern needs. A place where the community could gather, where history could be preserved, where the full story of Whitefish could be told without Montgomery censorship. "Once the legal questions are settled, I'm donating part of the Blackwood fortune to build it," Michael explained. "Seems fitting that Catherine and William's resources should finally serve the purpose they intended, benefiting the community, not just enriching one family." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Michael felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found not just a place, but a purpose. The soldier who had sought only peace and isolation had discovered something far more valuable: connection. To family across generations, to community across social divides, to a legacy of principled resistance against power and privilege. Shadow returned from his explorations, pressing against Michael's leg with familiar companionship. Together, they stood on land that had witnessed a century of concealed truths, now finally emerging into light. "Shadow's legacy," Michael said softly, the name feeling right for both the veterans' retreat and the community center he envisioned. Not just for the trio who had guided him to each discovery, but for the long shadow of William and Catherine's love, a force that had reached across time to restore justice and reclaim truth. The evening wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of earth and coming winter. In that moment, Michael Garrett, soldier builder, heir to a hidden legacy, felt truly home at last. 3 years later, Michael stood on the front porch of the Shadows Legacy Center, watching veterans engage in therapy activities across the sprawling grounds. The main building, constructed following William Morrison's design with modern adaptations, had become Whitefish's new landmark, a place where historical heritage blended with a healing mission. Shadow, older now but still healthy, lay beside him, watching a young veteran working with his own therapy dog. The center had helped over 100 former soldiers, many of whom found the peace Michael had sought when he first set foot on this land. In the town center, the Morrison Blackwood Community Hall had become the heart of local life, with a small museum telling the true story of William and Catherine, their timeless love and resilience. Thomas Blackwood, advanced in years but sharp in mind, often led tours, sharing stories he had witnessed as a boy. Michael took from his pocket the ring bearing the WM symbol, now displayed alongside William's ring in the museum's glass case most days. only removed for special occasions like today, the third anniversary of the final ruling that recognized his rightful ownership and the Morrison legacy. "We did it, didn't we, Shadow?" Michael said softly, ruffling the dog's ears. Shadow looked up, his intelligent brown eyes seeming to understand everything. From his vantage point, Michael could see the snow-capped mountains of Glacier National Park, the deep green pine forests, and the vast Montana sky. He had found the peace he sought, but in a way he could never have imagined. Not in isolation, but in building a community, in connecting with both past and future. Somewhere, he believed, William and Catherine were smiling too.